Okay, so today we're going to take a deep dive that starts with a single Sumatran rhino named Suci living at the Cincinnati Zoo.
Okay.
And from there, we're going to broaden things out to look at the extinction of megafauna throughout history and all over the world.
Sounds fascinating.
And the two sources that we're going to be looking at today are a detailed account of an attempt to artificially inseminate Suci and a broader exploration of prehistoric megafauna.
Interesting.
And so our goal today is going to be trying to connect the struggles that endangered species are facing today to the massive die-offs of the past.
Right.
So I guess, like, starting with this account of Suci, what really stood out to me was just the lengths that people are going to see to save these endangered mammals.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me was just this incredibly vivid picture that you get of her, the coarse reddish hair,
Yeah.
the skin that's described as pebbled, almost like linoleum, and even just this very specific description of her daily life, like the fact that she eats ficus leaves flown in all the way from San Diego and alongside more familiar treats like apples and grapes.
Yeah, it's really, I don't know, it makes her seem very real to me when I hear those details.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and then there's this whole attempt to artificially inseminate her by Dr. Terry Roth. And the source really goes into detail about how they induced ovulation and introduced frozen semen.
Interesting.
And it's a pretty invasive procedure. Dr. Roth actually reached far inside Suci using ultrasound via rectal insertion to try to determine if an egg had been released.
Wow.
But ultimately, it was not successful. No ovulation occurred.
Well, it seems like, in these early attempts to conserve these species, we were really taking a very human-centered approach. We were trying to make rhinos fit into our own understanding of animal husbandry. And, what we didn't really appreciate was the fact that these animals have very specific ecological and dietary needs, and these have been honed over millions of years in a very different environment from, a zero enclosure.
Right.
So it wasn't just about getting the right food, it was about recreating that entire environmental and social context.
Which is incredibly difficult.
Yeah. It was something that we couldn't do at that time.
Yeah, so this whole story of Suci kind of brings up the deeper evolutionary history of the species. And it turns out that their lineage stretches back about 20 million years to the Miocene.
That's right.
And so just for some context for our listeners, the Miocene was this really significant period of mammalian evolution.
Absolutely.
It stretched from about 23 to 5 million years ago.
Wow.
And Suci is actually a pretty close living relative of the woolly rhino.
Yeah.
You know, those giant ice age creatures that range from Scotland to South Korea.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And, the renowned biologist E.O. Wilson, he called the Sumatran rhino a living fossil. And he actually kept a tuft of Suci's mother's hair,
Oh, wow.
like a tangible connection to that ancient lineage.
That's remarkable.
So, when you think about it in that context, it really does make you appreciate that designation living fossil.
Yeah.
And especially when you think about the fact that they used to live across this huge area from the Himalayas down through Southeast Asia.
Right.
But their population has just plummeted due to habitat loss.
Yeah, it's really tragic.
And so now we're down to fewer than 100 individuals left in the entire world.
Yeah, and as we were saying earlier, those initial attempts to keep Sumatran rhinos in captivity were disastrous, really.
They didn't go well,
Yeah, there were really high death rates due to diseases like trypanosomiasis.
which is a parasitic disease transmitted by insects, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And even, the source mentions that they were giving the rhinos hay instead of fresh leaves and branches, which is what they eat in the wild.
Right. It seems like we just didn't know very much about them at the beginning.
No, we really didn't.
So all of this brings us to the Cincinnati Zoo's efforts and how critical they've become in the conservation of Sumatran rhinos.
Yes, absolutely.
And so they brought together the remaining rhinos in the United States, a female named Rapunzel, a female named Emi, and a male named Ipu.
Okay.
And so Dr. Roth, she faced all sorts of reproductive challenges.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Rapunzel was past her prime.
Yeah.
Emmy had ovulation issues that required carefully timed dates with Ipu, and then there were a bunch of miscarriages.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, and the source kind of, it reads like a drama about rhino reproduction,
I can imagine.
but there are such high stakes,
Of course, yeah.
So eventually they had a breakthrough, and they used hormone supplements, and this led to the births of Andala Suci and Harapan.
Wow.
And then Andalas was sent back to Sumatra, and he fathered a calf there.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and those were practically the only Sumatran rhino births in decades.
Yeah.
So it really is a testament to the work that they were doing at Cincinnati.
Absolutely. It's a huge achievement.
So we've been talking about Suci and her challenges, but, this isn't just a Sumatran rhino problem.
That's right.
Rhinos all over the world are critically endangered.
It's a global crisis.
Yeah. So there are Javan rhinos with fewer than 50 individuals left, Indian rhinos with about 3,000, black rhinos with about 5,000, and even white rhinos are now facing renewed poaching threats because of their horns.
It's so sad.
Yeah, it's really discouraging.
It is.
And so, all of this kind of makes me think about, we were talking about megafauna today, and rhinos are big.
Right.
The megafaunas of the past were even bigger, and they disappeared. And what made these giants that seemed so invincible, what made them vanish?
Well, the sources talk about this idea of being too big to quail.
Okay.
And for a long time, being big was a huge evolutionary advantage. It protected them from predators.
Right.
Think about adult elephants and hippos. They've pretty much no natural predators.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
But then humans came along, and that's when being big became a liability.
Interesting.
And so the source then goes on to talk about all these incredible creatures from the past.
Yeah, this is my favorite part.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It really captures your imagination.
It does.
So, we all know about mammoths and woolly rhinos, but there were also beavers the size of grizzly bears.
Really?
Yeah, and these creatures called glyptodonts that were like armadillos, but they were the size of a Fiat 500. Yeah, and then in New Zealand, there were these huge flightless birds called moas.
Moas.
Yeah, and some of them were almost 12 feet tall.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and the females were bigger than the males.
Oh, wow.
So, it really does make you wonder, what this world must have been like.
Yeah, it's a world that's lost to us now. And the disappearance of all of these creatures was a real mystery to early naturalists.
Right.
And Cuvier was a really important figure in this. He was one of the first to really recognize that extinction was a widespread phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And he initially thought it was because of some kind of global catastrophe.
Yeah.
But, later on, those catastrophic theories, they kind of fell out of favor. And so scientists were left with this question of, why did all these large animals die out in such a relatively short period of time, geologically speaking?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And Wallace, famous for his work on evolution alongside Darwin,
Right.
he described the world after these extinctions as zoologically impoverished.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, so our source talks about this place called Big Bone Lick in Kentucky, and it calls it the birthplace of American vertebrate paleontology.
Okay.
And it was here that a French explorer named Longueuil discovered mastodon teeth. And these teeth really influenced Cuvier's ideas about extinction.
Mm.
It's a really interesting story. These bones were shipped across the Atlantic to Europe, and Thomas Jefferson even displayed some of them at the White House.
Really?
Yeah. But the source says that if you go to Big Bone Lake State Park today, it's kind of a letdown.
Oh.
They've collected so many bones over the years that the museum is kind of sparse now, and they just have these kind of sad plastic recreations of mammoths and ground sloths.
Oh, that's disappointing.
Yeah, it is a little bit, but, the geological context of Big Bone Lake is really important.
Okay.
You see, this sulfurous, salty creek acted as a natural trap. It attracted animals who were looking for salt, and then they would kind of get stuck there and die. And this led to this accumulation of fossils, and it was at this very spot that early scientists started to really grapple with this mystery of why the megafauna disappeared.
So what were some of the theories that they came up with?
Well, there were two main competing explanations.
Okay.
One was climate change,
Okay.
and the other was human impact.
Okay.
So in terms of climate change, the last ice age ended, and there was this really significant shift from coniferous forests to deciduous forests.
Right.
And the climate overall became warmer, and, this would have had a big impact on the animals that were living at that time.
Yeah.
And, initially naturalists like Lyell and Darwin, they were inclined towards this explanation.
Okay.
But then there was this other explanation, human impact,
Okay.
which is often called prehistoric overkill.
Okay.
And the main argument here is that the timing of the extinctions really lines up with the patterns of human migration across the globe.
So like humans arrived and then the megafauna disappeared.
Exactly. So, first it was Australia, then the Americas, and then later islands like Madagascar and New Zealand.
So how do we know that humans were actually responsible for these extinctions?
Well, the source points to some really interesting evidence.
Okay.
So there's this analysis of Spormiella spores that were found in the sediments of Lynch's Crater in Australia.
Okay.
And these spores are really common in the dung of large herbivores.
Hmm.
And they show this really dramatic decline right around the time that humans first arrived on the continent.
Okay.
And this decline is followed by evidence of more frequent and intense fires and a change in the types of plants that were growing.
Interesting.
And the researchers who did this study, they interpret this as the loss of the mega herbivores leading to a buildup of flammable material, and that caused the fires.
And then that changed the environment.
Exactly. And one of the researchers is actually quoted as saying, categorically, that climate was not the main driver of these extinctions in Australia.
Wow.
So then there's the evidence from New Zealand, and this is even more direct, you know?
Gotcha.
So when the Maori people arrived in New Zealand, the moas disappeared incredibly quickly.
Wow.
And archaeologists have found these massive middens, which are basically ancient trash heaps full of moa bones.
Oh, wow.
And there are even Maori oral traditions and language that refer to the loss of the moas.
So it's pretty clear that humans were hunting them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But, you know, not everyone is convinced by this prehistoric overkill hypothesis. Some scientists are skeptical that relatively small groups of humans with primitive technology could have wiped out so many large animals across entire continents.
Okay.
They point out that just because human arrival and extinction events happened around the same time, that doesn't automatically mean that one caused the other.
Right.
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Yeah.
And this is where the work of John Alroy comes in.
Okay.
He used computer simulations to try to answer this question of how could small numbers of early humans cause such widespread extinctions?
And what did he find?
Well, his simulations showed that even small human populations with moderate hunting skills could drive slow reproducing megafauna to extinction over centuries.
Interesting.
The key factor here is that these large mammals, they just couldn't reproduce fast enough to keep up with even moderate hunting pressure.
Yeah, they have long gestation periods. They usually only have one offspring at a time, and it takes a while for them to reach sexual maturity.
Exactly.
So even a small number of humans hunting them could have a big impact over time.
That's right.
Wow.
And Alroy also talks about this idea of sustainable harvest.
Okay.
He suggests that early humans could have hunted faster reproducing species like deer without driving them to extinction. But when they hunted slower reproducing species like mammoths, those populations couldn't recover.
So mammoths were kind of like a luxury food.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And what's also really interesting is that this whole process of decline would have been almost imperceptible to the people who were living through it. The source quotes Alroy describing it as a geologically instantaneous ecological catastrophe, too gradual to be perceived.
So basically, like, mammoths were becoming less and less common, but people didn't really notice because it was happening so slowly.
Right, it was happening over generations,
Yeah.
and they didn't have any records to compare it to.
Right, so they wouldn't have known that mammoths were once much more abundant.
Exactly.
Wow, that's kind of scary.
It is a little bit unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this understanding has some pretty big implications for how we view our relationship with the natural world today.
Okay.
You know, the megafauna extinctions, they tell us that humans have been changing the world for a very long time.
Longer than we usually think.
Yeah, way before the Industrial Revolution and all of that.
Yeah.
And for large, slow reproducing animals, the arrival of humans really changed the game. Being big used to be a good strategy, but now it's a liability.
Yeah, like we were talking about with the rhinos. And I guess that's why we're seeing all these threats to elephants and bears and big cats today.
Right. They're all facing the same challenges that the megafauna of the past faced.
Yeah, and you know, the source also talks about how the extinction of megafauna in the past led to some big ecological changes.
Yeah, like in Australia, the loss of all those large herbivores led to a transformation of the landscape.
Yeah, and I guess that makes sense. If you don't have these giant animals eating the plants and moving around the environment, things are going to change.
Exactly. And so I think this whole story really challenges this idea that humans used to live in harmony with nature.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not a very accurate picture of the past.
Yeah,
So we started with this story of Suci and her individual struggle for survival.
right.
And I think it really reflects this much larger pattern of megafauna decline.
Yeah, she's a symbol of what's happening to large animals all over the world.
Yeah, and it highlights how long humans have been impacting these populations.
Yeah, for tens of thousands of years.
So I guess the question for our listeners today is, do you think the story of the megafauna extinction is a cautionary tale? You know, does it suggest that even small actions by humans can have really big consequences over time?
I think it does.
Yeah.
And I think it makes you wonder about our role in the current extinction crisis.
Yeah. I mean, are we just repeating the same mistakes of the past?
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah. So I think that's a good place to end our deep dive today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me.
It was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And thanks to all of our listeners for joining us.
Yeah, we appreciate you.
See you coming.